Look, Ken, thanks very much for joining me today. We're going to be discussing the Syrian civil war, and you're going to be sharing a couple of views on this in your personal capacity, of course. It seems to me that the Syrian civil war has really dropped out of the international media lately. I mean, since June, we've been bombarded with news of ISIS. For the last couple of years, there's been very intense coverage about the humanitarian crisis that's been going on in there, particularly a lot of the violence that's been going on amongst the rebel groups. But really, not a lot lately. What's been going on?
Well, the Syrian civil war now has been going on for about 3.5 years. It really started back in June of 2011. So that's actually quite a long time for a country to be going through the violent armed politics of a civil war. Most recently, what we're seeing is some very serious developments in that they potentially limit options for the coalition in the future. What we've seen is the last vestiges, or I guess the final elements. That's probably a bit too doom and gloom, but some of the strongest elements of what we were calling the moderate Syrian opposition were recently defeated by Jabhat al-Nusra and other elements, and we're seeing that the last elements of moderate opposition are really in the south, far south of Damascus. That puts the situation in an interesting state where you have the ISIS, the Islamic State, in the west, controlling much of the territory on the border of Iraq, and then you have the regime with a few strongholds. But then you have an Islamic alliance consisting of Jabhat al-Nusra, an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, and several other groups that are not affiliated with Al-Qaeda who appear to have an alliance together. And these groups are just Islamist. They are looking for an end to the Assad regime and the establishment of some kind of Islamic-based republic.
Can I just ask really quickly, you said that a lot of the groups, and I assume you're talking here about the Free Syrian Army and some of the groups within that, were defeated by Jabhat al-Nusra. I mean, if they all had the same vision, how does it come to that, and why would Jabhat al-Nusra want to sort of stamp its dominance in that regard?
Well, I wouldn't say that they all had the same vision necessarily. Right. There's a lot of differences, and I think that one of the best ways to look at it is you really need to think of a civil war, particularly the Syrian civil war, as a situation of armed politics. If you go back to June 2011, when the violent opposition really began, you can think of it almost in the evolutionary terms of a punctuated equilibrium. So Assad had great control over Syria, ran the state very ruthlessly, but it was a controlled environment. Then the Arab Spring and the violent opposition caused a punctuated equilibrium where suddenly many opposition groups sprung up and many armed opposition groups sprung up. Now, in the beginning, from about 2011 into 2012 and even to the beginning of 2013, many of those groups claimed that they wanted a non-sectarian, democratic Syria without Assad, but a Syria that would respect the religious rights of all the different sects that live in Syria. There were also groups, Islamist groups, that also established themselves, and these groups had to ally with each other in order to defeat Assad. But this sort of armed politics that goes on becomes very dependent on resources. Because if you think about it, if Natalie walked out today and wanted to start her own militia and start her own rebellion, you'd have to pay your soldiers, you'd have to arm them, you'd have to feed them, you'd have to establish some kind of order, and that all requires resources. And so much of the problem that the Free Syrian Army had was establishing control over resources and establishing a single sort of chain of resources. That was sort of, the Free Syrian Army was an attempt to gain a unity of effort among all these groups.
So are you saying that lack of resources, the ability to control resources in that regard, is what led to their perhaps subjugation by Jabhat al-Nusra, or are there other factors where that's the dominant factor?
Well, I think it's a very dynamic process where this happened, and I think
Right.
in 20 years, when the history is written on the Syrian civil war, we'll be in a much better place to understand what happened and how it happened. But it is clear that several of these groups had various sponsors. Some of them were private sponsors, and some of them had other ways of getting their resources. There's indications that Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United States were supporting various rebel groups. But they weren't doing it through the Free Syrian Army or through the brief period where the Free Syrian Army had established a supreme military command. That supreme military, or it was actually called the Supreme Military Council.
Right.
Now that was an attempt to achieve unity of effort of all these various armed political actors in Syria. However, that group, the Supreme Military Council, did not control the resources. So all of these disparate groups had to have loyalty to sources of their resources, whether that be their proxies, or whether that be their sponsors,
Yep.
or whether it be some other source of funding. Making those decisions about funding and about resources were decisions essentially about survival. And so
Right.
in some cases, they had to ally themselves with other groups. They weren't strong enough alone to defeat Assad's forces, so even some of the more moderate groups were forced to work with,
Deal with the devil.
well, so to speak, yes, absolutely. And in some cases that meant Jabhat al-Nusra. In some cases it meant the Islamist groups that don't support al-Qaeda. But that made it very hard for the coalition to determine and to vet different groups. If you look at this group, they're working with Jabhat al-Nusra. Do we want to support them?
Sure.
The answer is no. So all of these pressures led to very constrained resources and really led to fragmentation.
Sure. I mean, just talking about this historically, obviously this is not unique to the Syrian civil war. The proxy-sponsor relationship is what I'm talking about. It seems to me that one of your core observations is that the lack of control of resources is what's led to perhaps some of the internal challenges of the Free Syrian Army and its associated groups. Has there been another historical precedent where you could point to, where you say, look, this displayed all of the challenges of the Syrian Army case, but overcame them? I mean, is there a historical case that you could point to?
Well, I think there are many historical cases in the aggregate, and I think each historical case is different. So
Sure.
searching for the exact parallel is difficult. But it is clear and it is empirical it is proven, I guess you could say, that the resources and external support to an insurgent group is usually the biggest factor in determining success or failure of an insurgent group. Resources become incredibly important, but it's also been demonstrated that external support in a civil war makes that civil war last longer and makes it more deadly. So these are factors that I think policymakers take into account. If they begin to sponsor either the government side or an insurgent side in a civil war, they are going to likely extend the length and the casualties in the civil war. But it also is the most important factor in determining an outcome.
So at the moment, the Americans and the Australians have provided limited support to some groups in Syria, if I'm not mistaken. Given the limited nature of that kind of assistance, compared to, for instance, like the heavy military involvement that we've got in Iraq, I'm talking comparatively, of course, what actually will be done? How do we then even begin to address issues like ISIS, for instance, within Syria?
Well, I would say that the coalition strategy is very much an Iraq first strategy.
Sure. Yes.
And so it's unclear when, but if and when the Iraqi government, with the help of the coalition, is able to push ISIS out of Iraq and reestablish control, then of course, if the ultimate goal is to destroy ISIS, then obviously something has to happen in Syria. One of the problems with the Syrian civil war is that there don't seem to be a lot of good options for the coalition in Syria. A very small, what we would call a moderate opposition groups in the far south. Assad and his regime are strong because Assad has his own sponsors, very much with Iran and Russia supplying resources to Assad that has allowed him to remain strong. Then, of course, there is ISIS, who controls a good deal of the West. But more and more what we're seeing is an Islamic alliance made up of groups that include Jabhat al-Nusra. But I think it's also important to understand that the Islamic alliance also has groups that were once part of the Free Syrian Army and that were once seeking a Syria that would not sponsor terrorism, was not associated with al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. So that puts the coalition in an interesting position. You have basically three bad options, or at least what most people would consider three bad options. So there's a long way to go in developing this strategy and the next phase of the conflict.
Right. So I think part of that, what we can take away, is that resources are key.
I think so.
And
yes.
time to develop a plan to make sure that those elements that we do want to support are separated from those that we don't wish to.
I think so, and I think that it's also important to remember that resources may in fact determine the character of a group.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that in the case of if you're involved in the armed politics of a civil war, you have to make decisions that are based on survival. So if you have resources and you have power, you can control the agenda, so to speak. But if you don't have enough resources, then you may have to make compromises. And it's clear that as the moderate Syrian opposition was starved, decimated, and then absorbed, those elements and individuals that have been absorbed into these other groups had to make decisions.
So unintentional consequences, in other words, that deviate from what the sponsor's intentions were.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for joining me again, Ken. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And,
I hope it was
hopefully
helpful.
We'll keep our eye on the Syrian conflict as well.
Absolutely.